Hey, welcome everybody. Niels, Sherry,
Hey there.
welcome to
Hello.
this conversation. And for those that are watching, welcome. We're glad that you've joined us. Um, this conversation about race, we actually haven't named this conversation other than Niels said, "Hey, we got to talk about this, and we got to, get some conversation happening and some perspective, and kind of explore this what we're seeing kind of popping up on the news cycle so much lately." And so that's what this is about. And primarily it's going to be Sherry and Niels sharing their own experiences and their own thoughts. I'll kind of guide a little bit, ask some questions, and I don't think I'll throw in any jokes, but we'll leave that department to Niels.
Yeah, exactly.
But my name is Andy Wood. I am the pastor at Winnipeg Center Vineyard and the Engage Catalyst for Vineyard Canada. And I'm a pastor, I'm a father, I'm a brother, I'm a foster dad, and all of those things actually have given me firsthand experience witnessing the issues surrounding being a person of color in a white majority kind of world. My brother is a Cree, and so we grew up together clearly, and so I witnessed, growing up in small town Western Canada, some of the ways that he was treated that I wasn't, just because of his skin color, and hearing the stories. I'm Métis also in terms of my ancestry, as you can see right there, my flag. And so hearing some of the stories of like my mom and my grandpa, and beyond as well, of kind of trying to move away from that, of disassociating themselves from that, it's all very much related to this conversation. Although clearly I interact with the world and the world interacts with me as a white male, and so that's just how that is. But that's a little bit about me. I'm wondering, Sherry and Niels, if you guys could introduce yourselves and kind of tell a little bit about what brought you to this conversation.
Sure, I can start. So I'm Sherry Ansloos, and I am Cree and English, and I am a member of the Fisher River Cree Nation and part of Treaty 5. And so I come to this conversation because I'm also a child of the 60s and 70s scoop, which is where in the 60s and 70s, there were many Indigenous children that were adopted into white families. And I have a lovely parents, mom and dad, who are from Southern Manitoba. So I have this wonderful heritage of my German and English family, and that's what I am because I've been adopted into that. But I also have this other part of my life, which is my Cree ancestry and also my English ancestry. So I often say that I am the epitome, I am a walking manifestation of the political climate in Canada. I am half of me Indigenous and the other half with very strong connection to my settler roots. So that's why I'm here, part of this conversation.
Awesome.
My name is Niels Jeyasegara, and Jeyasegara, that is of Sri Lankan descent. That is my background. That is what both my parents are. I was raised in a single parent home, and then Niels is a German name. And so I was actually born in Frankfurt, Germany. I grew up in Toronto, lived there from age 7, and then when I was 18, moved to Manitoba, then lived in Moose Jaw and Yellowknife. And so you can just imagine that anytime somebody asks me, where are you from? I have a bit of an identity crisis, because I'm like, are they asking me like if I'm from Moose Jaw, or like, do I say Winnipeg? Do I say Toronto? Or they're like, no, like what's your name? Niels, German, but you're Sri Lankan. Yeah, you know what I mean? So yeah, so and then now with just like some of the racial tensions and just everything that's going on, it's been really challenging for me to see friends of mine affected by this, as I also have been affected by this. And so what brings me to this conversation is just that you guys, and for those who will maybe listen later, are willing to join in and just hear what we have to say, and then also reflect and respond to everything that's going on.
Beautiful. Yeah. I'm curious, what's your short answer to where are you from?
Yeah, so it honestly it depends on where I am, because if I'm like in Toronto in the elevator and someone as in like if I'm visiting my mom, somebody might ask me and they could be of the same skin color as me or different, and they'll be like, "Where are you from?" And I know what they're asking. They're
Yeah.
asking like, "What is your Sri Lankan heritage?"
Yeah.
Just to like, or they want me to say like Sri Lankan or Indian, right? Something that would match close to my skin color. I'll like to mess with them, so I'll be like one time I said, "I'm from Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan." Well, where were you from before that?
Right. Yeah.
Oh, I lived in Winnipeg.
Right.
No, before that,
Yeah,
Toronto. But okay, where were you born?
Yeah.
Germany.
Right. Yeah.
They're like so confused. They're like, okay, what is your background? You're like your heritage. Like, where's your mom and dad? Oh, Sri Lanka. Like, oh, okay. And then it's time to get off the elevator right around that time.
You know exactly what they're asking the whole time. You're just playing with them.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Gotta have some fun.
Yeah. Oh, awesome. That's great. Hey, let's jump right in. I mean, clearly we're looking at the news. We're seeing we're following social media. There's just so much that's ripe in the climate. I'm wondering if you could share some personal experiences of racism with us. You want to start, Sherry?
Sure, I can. So probably for me, the first time I ever experienced blatant racism was when I was a little kid. I was probably about maybe 7 or 8 years old, and I was with my family. We were on a trip in our station wagon out to see the Rockies, and we stayed at a little motel on the road called the David Thompson Resort. Interestingly enough, the explorer David Thompson was very sympathetic to the Indigenous people. And so this resort that we were staying at was called the David Thompson Resort. And a car rolled into the resort area, and my brothers and I were outside playing with an actual family of Indigenous kids. So there was a whole bunch of them. They were outside playing, and so we were there with them. And one of my brothers is dark-haired, Scottish dark-haired, and the other was blonde, and then there was me. And so we were playing there, and this car rolled down the window to look at the motel, but when saw all of these kids playing there, kind of sneered out the window, "Oh, there's a bunch of expletive Indians," and then sped off out of the parking lot. And so for me, that was the very first time that I experienced racism, and what it had me begin the question of like, well, what does it mean to be an Indian? What is that part of me, and how does that play out in the existence that I know being adopted into a family? I think I've also experienced other kinds of racism. Like I've been in company where I've heard disparaging remarks made about Indigenous people and them not knowing that I was Indigenous. Sometimes people will, when they find out, they'll give a brief, explanation saying like, "Oh, well, I don't mean like people like you," or other kind of microaggressions where people might, say some like common stereotypical colloquialism that's actually racist, or verbal comments, even the verbal comment that you get, Niels, that you said like, "Where are you from?" Like, why does that matter? And I've also seen, blatant acts of racist aggression against people of color who are Indigenous, Black, Asian, Middle Eastern, Filipino. I've seen all of that happen. Basically, any non-visibly white person, I think I have witnessed in my life racism against those people groups. So it's a very common experience. And actually, there's a national race relations study in Canada that was done in 2019. And it said that the majority of Canadians who are Black, 54%, and 53% of Indigenous people have personally experienced discrimination due to race or ethnicity. Wow. And that compared to white population would be 12%. So it's kind of significant.
Yeah, it is. It is. Thank you for sharing that story. Yeah, what about for you, Niels?
For me, one of the moments that I recall is actually recently, or like 10 years ago, and then one that was about 3 years ago in the military. I'm in the Air Force right now, serving as a pilot. And when I was in the Army Reserves, we were on the range, the St. Charles Range, just west of Winnipeg, and we were formed up, lined up outside. It was dark. We were doing a roll call, like they were just calling our names. And then they called my name. They're like, Jeyasegara. And then I responded, Sergeant. And then they're like, where are you? And I'm like, I'm here, Sergeant. And then they said something like, smile, I can't see you. And then this seemed like funny at the time because this was like the culture of making jokes, both like racial jokes and sexual jokes, different culture in the military, even though that was only like just over 10 years ago, right? So that was like the kind of the start of like that pain. And then a few years ago, 3 years ago, I grew a beard. I mean, now in the military, we're allowed to have beards, but I grew a beard about 3 years ago because I was going on an Arctic survival course in Resolute Bay in Nunavut. That's halfway up between Yellowknife and Alert, top of Canada. And I had come back and I had some frostbite and frost nip on my face. And so the doctor let me keep the beard for another month to let the face heal up. And then guys at work were making jokes saying like, oh, like, hey, like you look like a terrorist or things like that. And so, and you know, like jokes like that were made. And so that really hurt. And it happened on like 3 to 5 different occasions. Now, here's like the positive outcome that happened was that, well, or what the good thing that happened out of this just prior to was like, I was so affected by it, but like that was the first time I actually felt like quitting the military and such. And it took me like 3 or 4 days to work up the courage to go and talk with my supervisor about it. Now, ideally, you just want to go and tell the other person who has offended you, but it just like brought back all the experiences from the past. But I didn't want to go to my supervisor and tattle on them. But then what I did do was that I did go and talk to my supervisor and I said, hey, if this can just be handled in the most discreet way possible, like I'd really appreciate that. Like I know that they were joking, you know, like I know sometimes like within our unit, like we make jokes like that. It would be good if that would just stop altogether and such. And so my supervisor handled it and they apologized and like jokes actually began to stop. That like it actually like improved the work culture. And then like I remember 3 weeks ago, somebody made another joke. It wasn't directed at me. And then somebody just had the courage to say, hey, like that's actually racist. Like we shouldn't do that. So that was a positive outcome. And I can't say that all situations within the military or other organizations or government organizations that happens, but I think if the outcome had been different, my morale would have been much lower. But those are my experiences.
Mm-hmm. That's really, thank you for sharing those. Those are really personal. I'm really glad that you mentioned the culture element of it, because it seems to me like that's a big part of what when we talk about racism, we can talk about those personal interactions, and then we can also talk about like cultures and meaning like subcultures, really like this, like yours of the military, but also large cultures like what's going on in our whole society as Canadians or North Americans that is contributing to these personal instances of racism, right? Like it's really fascinating to me. I'm curious, Niels, what was it like moving from Toronto to the prairies for you?
Yeah, so I would say it was actually a bit of culture shock, right? Because I was born in Germany, but I was actually born in Frankfurt. So that's a big city. And then moved to Toronto, again, another big city. I grew up a Christian, right? So I was in a really diverse church. It was called Agincourt Pentecostal Church. It was a church really large of like maybe 2,000 to 3,000 at the time. And it was one of the most multicultural churches, maybe in all of Canada, but for sure Toronto. Toronto in itself was the most multicultural city in the world. And so I grew up in diversity. Like that was the norm. Our youth group was also like very, very diverse. And then like this is going to tie in nicely, but like, you know, us as cool kids, we would say things like, and talk to each other using cool language, like, what's up, homie? Like, what's good, dog? Like, yo, I'm just keeping it real. Like, what's good with you, Holmes, right? And if you didn't know what that means, urbandictionary.com. But, right? And then the transition of moving from Toronto to the prairies, because I came out to Bible college and to attend Providence University College, it was unique. Because when I would talk like that, which I thought it was just people from Toronto who talk like that, people would say things like, oh, like, why are you talking black? Or why are you sounding like that? Or why are you sounding like a black person? So that was like confusing for me to process that, because now a skin color was associated with the way I talked. Yet my youth group was filled with all sorts of different colors, and everyone just seemed to naturally talk that way. And it was a bit of a culture shock coming to Providence too, when there were some that who maybe, depending on the environment that they grew up in, if they were from a rural town, like when they first came to Prov, that might have been the first time they had ever seen someone of a different color. And Providence did have international students, like black students, students from Asia. And so that was interesting hearing people say, like, this is the first time I've seen a colored person before. And I'm like, where am I? And so that was a bit of a culture shock for myself, for sure.
For sure. Hey, I'd like to shift gears a little bit. Let's kind of focus our attention to like the current sort of news cycle, and maybe even really specifically like George Floyd's death. What would you say, and what are your reactions to that video or that event? And also, then I would say, like the Black Lives Matter, and then also like there's, you know, yeah, but all lives, you know, and we'll unpack that particular thing a little bit, but just kind of the events surrounding George Floyd. You want to give some comment to that, Sherry?
Sure. Well, I think like anyone who has compassion within them, when they look at that video, you can't help but have disgust and just a visceral response to what was happening. I think for me, I felt actually encouraged a little bit. It's interesting to see the world's reaction to that video, but I feel encouraged by the outrage, and I'll try to explain what I mean. A number of years ago, I did some travel in the U.S., and it was during just before the inauguration of the current president. And I was in a rural area, and I couldn't help but think when I was there, listening to some of just the conversations, because I was curious. You know, I asked, you know, like, so what do you think about your new president? And, you know, asking questions, and I couldn't help but see a similarity between some of the answers and the attitudes and the culture of that area with my Southern Manitoba cultural roots. And I've often said in matters of racism and discrimination that those kinds of general attitudes that are oppressive in nature are not only happening in the United States, that they're very much present in Canada. And we're not far off from some of those sentiments, although we might not be aware of it, or maybe want to acknowledge that it's there. So I think when I saw the footage that was happening, and the response to what the footage of the response to what was happening, I felt hopeful, to be honest, because instead of just seeing people protesting that were in the Black community, you saw people protesting around the world, and from every demographic, and from young children to elderly, and every cultural representation marching and demonstrating. And so to me, that felt so hopeful, and made me feel like there is something happening, where there is an awakening to the injustices. And it reminds me a little bit of my reaction to the Truth and Reconciliation report in Canada. When I read it, one of the lines that stuck out to me, and I don't know if every Canadian has read the Truth and Reconciliation report, but I encourage every Canadian to read it. But one of the things that stood out for me was a line in there that kind of just like stung me. And it was the line that says, "For the child taken and the parent left behind." And I guess that line stung me a little bit because of my own experience of being adopted. But I've written a poetry collection that explores some of the racial tension and truth and reconciliation issues. And one of the poems that I wrote was concerning that. And the reaction that has happened online reminded me of one of the stanzas. And this is what I wrote. And I'm just going to read it to you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not the whole thing, but basically the poem is saying, like, for the child taken and the parent left behind, I'm angry that this is our legacy, that this is our Canadian story. 1,000 apologies are a beginning, but will never make up for this devastation. They're needles poking at justice in a haystack of hurt, and it will take more than mere words to right this wrong. I'm disgusted that someone thought it wise and good to sever love by means of hate without anyone standing up with moral integrity to shout, "No, stop. This cannot happen. There has to be another way." Good people with conscience, where was your humanity? And when I read that line, good people with conscience, where was your humanity? When I look at the footage of people protesting, I begin to feel hopeful that there are people with good conscience that are beginning to stand up to say, hey, where is our humanity? And what are we going to actually do to put boots to the ground to make a difference within our communities?
Wow, thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, I want to ask a follow-up question and maybe just draw this out like a good Vineyard person. You know, where do you see the Spirit moving?
Yeah. You know, I feel like that is a question, you know, that the Spirit is asking, you know. It's like when we see, you know, the words, "I can't breathe." I feel like that's the voice of Jesus, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if we're made in the image of Christ, and there's that kind of oppression within our countries, you know, can the Spirit breathe?
Yeah.
I don't think he can. But I feel like it's a question in the air.
Wow.
It's a question in the air for our countries, you know.
Yeah.
With the Spirit saying, I long to breathe. I long to breathe over the people, over the countries, over the world, you know. I wasn't expecting to cry.
Me neither, but there we are. Well, all three of us, I think.
Yeah, that was so good, yeah.
Oh man, Niels, what's been your observations or the impact as you've observed?
I'll just just to something that Sherry said as well, and then I'll go into my observation, was that like with the protests, like I heard somebody in a webinar, they had said like, is it actually like a unique picture of the church, of people gathering of every nation and tribe and tongue? I mean, that was just something really unique to think of when I heard that, right? When we think about the peaceful protesting. And then like for me, it actually took me about a week to process how serious the video was, partly because I feel as though like I had become numb, and this is not a good stance to have, but numb towards the racism that has been against Black people or Indigenous. And then it also was me not wanting to relive the pain of the racism that I've experienced. Another thing that was hard was seeing some of my friends who are Black, some of my mentors, some of my leaders, someone who have been like a father figure to me. Like I'm thinking of my youth pastor and my junior high pastor, like who are both Black, and they were just so hurt and so broken by this. And so they were vocal about it on social media. And so it was tough to see people who are just so broken by this, people that I love, just affected by this in such a deep level, that I texted one of them and said, man, like I had no idea that this is the kind of pain like you experienced. I said, like, how did you like handle all this when you were like discipling us? And he just says, like, and he said to me, he's just like, Niels, my only focus was that we would empower the next generation so that you could go forward and serve God and make a difference. Not realizing that there were times like on his way to church where he would get like over, and I'm a youth pastor, I'm the junior high pastor here, right? And so all that pain just came back, and so it sparked a traumatic response, I think, and a bit of an uproar. And another thing too, I was thinking of also like my friends of mine in Yellowknife, black friends of mine who were extremely affected by this, where one of my friends who's a mom, because I was actually a part of the Yellowknife Vineyard community, love those guys, miss them, Winnipeg now, little sidebar there, but she had posted on Facebook that like she dreads having the conversation with her black son about what to do if you get pulled over by the police. And I'm picturing this kid in my mind, he's somewhere within the 6 to 8 year old range, that it won't seem fair, but it's not about it not being fair. It's about you coming home alive. And so you're going to need to comply with what they do. So it wrecked me that in the year 2020, that this is a conversation that needs to be had with kids, right? Someone who's black, someone who's indigenous. There were 2 nights during the week of when finally like the emotion of the video hit me, where I was crying and falling asleep in tears, and Gail, my wife, was just like, what's wrong? And then I would tell her, and I'd have to go for a walk, and then I'd come back. And so I think it was just like such a overwhelming amount of emotion for me, but it took about 6 to 7 days for it to eventually get to me, because at first it was just numb.
Yeah, and understandably too, right?
Yeah.
Wow. Can you guys comment a little bit on some of the backlash? I don't know what else to call it, but just just some of the commentary that's challenging some of the protests. You know, I think of people that would say, you know, well, wait a minute, yeah, Black Lives Matter, but all lives matter, right? And that kind of reaction. Can you just comment, either of you?
Sure, I could maybe take a stab at it.
Sure.
I think when, you know, the line that often gets said is, well, all lives matter, you know. I think when you say that, like there's something, you know, really practical and common sense about that, where when people say that, where you're like, yeah, it's true, all lives do matter. But I think that you cannot say that all lives matter when we have had hundreds of years where the lives of people of color have actually not mattered.
Yeah.
You can't say that when there's been that history. And I know that if we look even in the Canadian context, we have a history of racism from, I can just give you a list, you know, from the Atlantic slave trade to Indigenous people who've lost their lives because defending their land because of sickness or famine, lives lost to the residential schools, lives lost to police brutality, Muslims within Canada whose lives are targeted and threatened because of their religion, stolen sisters from murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and even down to like recent examples, Chantal Moore, the 26-year-old that was fatally shot last month during a mental health wellness check, or Regis Korchinski-Paquette, who fell to her death after police responded for another mental health emergency, or in the case of Gerald Stanley, who was the white farmer who shot Colton Bushy, an Indigenous man, in the head, but was acquitted by an all-white jury. Allegations of racism and police brutality that was just recently brought forward by an Alberta First Nations chief, Alan Adam, in northern Alberta, and I could probably go on and on.
Yeah.
So you can't say that all lives matter when it's evident that some lives are not mattering. And I love what Pope Francis has said recently, where he said that we cannot tolerate or turn a blind eye to racism and exclusion of any form and yet claim to defend the sacredness of every human life. So, yeah, I just, when I hear those kinds of statements, it's upsetting to me. And we just, have to understand the sacredness of human life. And if you believe in the sacredness of human life, then when you see these injustices where the sacredness of human life is not being honored, then we as the Christian community have to stand up and say something and do something about that.
Yeah. As we historically, and I'm talking long time ago, historically have done. I'm thinking of the early church, right? Tremendous diversity and standing up for each other, sharing with each other. Niels, what would you have to add or offer or other perspective to that?
Yeah, during the time when, even now as social media and as posts are out there, supporting Black Lives Matter, I got a few messages from people, and thankfully, it didn't go to any arguments. It was just more actually it was actually an opportunity for me to explain, but somebody would actually say hey, it's all lives matter. And then I would say, you're right. Of course, all lives do matter, but we recognize that Black people and Indigenous people, as an example, they are dying at a rapid rate, right? And it's this example in Matthew 5 when Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," right? But imagine that one guy in the back is well, what about the middle class? What about the rich, right?
Yeah.
Or it's so we wouldn't apply that logic then, right? Or it's on Epilepsy Awareness Day, right? We're not going to be well, what about cancer and what about the other sicknesses? And we say yes, those do matter. But as Christians, we're created in God's image, but we recognize that in the United States that there are systems that have been put in place in which Black people do get treated worse than other races. In Canada, we see it against the Indigenous, right? And so as believers, we are called to stand up and advocate for them.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, I like that. And I've seen that as a cartoon. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Jesus. Blessed are everybody.
Yeah.
That's great that you brought up as believers and as the church. What do you think? And just speaking to different communities of faith and Christians, individuals, but also the communities and the church as a whole. What do you both see as ways that the church should respond to these, the issues of racism and discrimination, that kind of thing?
I could speak to that, Andy. I think that there are a number of things that churches can do. And I think the very first thing is that churches have to begin at the beginning. So we go back to our scripture and we go back to the creation story where it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and everything in it. And when he created man as the pinnacle and all of the things that he created, he said that it was good. And so to acknowledge that we are made in the image of God, and that we're made for him, right? And as Christians, we need to know that spiritual transformation begins with ourselves, right? Where we have a change of our heart. And I think when we look at the things that are going on in the world in terms of racial discrimination and the tension, it really is a beginning at the root of it. It's a heart issue, right? The reality is sin and darkness within our world, and real transformation happens on an individual level. And as we as people are transformed and renewed in our mind in the ways that we think, then I believe that that's when we step out and we bring societal change. But that change has to happen with individuals in their hearts. So I think that's the very first thing is let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to us, the very core of who we are, and have our hearts transformed and our minds transformed so that we can be like-minded with Christ. I think the second thing that we as a church need to do is we need to begin to listen to stories. And in the Canadian context, we've had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and people say, well, you know, we need to listen to the stories and then we need to reconcile. But I think even in Canada, as it is around the world, I think the truth telling is just beginning. I don't even think we can get to reconciliation until we begin the truth telling. And so that means that we have to engage in hard and heavy conversations, and even engage in this hard and heavy season of racial tension, and not be afraid of it, and not try to just, like, you know, smooth it over and make it better. Just like get in that and sit in that. And as Niels had explained, like, get in touch with the emotions that that brings, whether they be good or bad. I think that there is, as we've said before, an invitation for us right now to enter into racial reconciliation, and it starts definitely by listening to stories. I think the third thing that we can do as a church is begin to learn together. So just doing exactly what we're doing here right now is having people of color on panels where we're talking about this very thing. So that there's balanced voice and perspective, you know, that's maybe different from your perspective, and learn by listening, you know, like, you know, not, you know, explaining yourself away, but just listening to hear what people have to say and to hear the heart. I think, like, you can only really learn when you've sat and listened and you have heard the whole story, and then we can begin to ask questions. I think that the fourth way that we as the church can respond is to make space. And so when I think of racial reconciliation, or even the word reconciliation, I like to say reconciliation. What are the actions? What are the things that we're going to do, and the space that we're going to make for people to engage in these conversations, and to make space for actual reconciliation to happen. And I think it happens by some practical things like diversity in leadership, you know, inviting people of diversity into places of authority to begin to speak and lead and shape the things that are happening within our communities. Making room means that you give people of color an opportunity to see themselves within their people. You know, I one of the things that I do all the time, this might sound really silly, but whenever I'm obviously drawn to people of color, because I am one myself, even though I need a better tan, to be honest. But I always invite them to come to our church community, and I say to them, we need you. Our church needs your representation. We lack our African brothers within our community. We lack their vibrancy. We lack their passion. You know, we need more, you know, people from the Asian community. You know, we love you, and we want your expression within our community. You know, when I think of the Church of Jesus, you know, the Pharisees were so upset with the work of Jesus because he was disrupting their privilege, right? He was disrupting their situation where they were the ones that it was, you know, a Jewish messianic tradition. But now all of a sudden Jesus came and he created a multi-ethnic family through his work on the cross. And so our churches need to represent that multi-ethnic family. And so I think, like, making space and room, inviting people, like calling them in to say, we need you within the church community. Because I think, like, as a whole, we are called to navigate this together. We can't do that in isolation. So I think those are four things that we can do within the church. So start at the beginning, listen to the stories, learn, and then make space and share space.
Yeah. I love that you say sit. What the church can do is, like, to intentionally sit in those awkward places to listen. Awkward for me, maybe.
Yeah.
and that's to me that reminds me of the reality that I can choose that or not as a white guy. Like, I can choose to put myself into those conversations or not.
Yeah.
Hashtag privilege right there, right? Like it's like that's something that I know that many people of color, anyways, it just doesn't, it just comes to you. You don't have to necessarily go to it.
Yeah.
And so I would speak to sort of the majority culture, or the majority like white culture, anyways. That it does take intention and to embrace that. And the intention, but also the tension as well, the uncomfortability of it.
Yeah.
Kind of
And
putting
if it's any consolation, like for people who share the stories, like it's not easy or comfortable to be vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
It's not an easy position to be the one to share where there's been vulnerability, you know? And so I think like there's an equal vulnerability, you know, for those who share the story and for those who listen, who maybe feel like, wow, this feels really hard for me to hear, or this feels attacking to me, or this challenges something that I've never had to think about before. It's doing something, you know. I think like those are things when those things rise up in us, those feelings where, you know, it's like touching a vein and all of a sudden up comes like a feeling, like pay attention to that, you know. That's telling you something, you know, and maybe feel it, don't say anything.
Good point.
And then go back to your prayer time and ask the Spirit, what was that about?
Yeah.
Why was I like mad when she said the word white privilege? Why was I mad when, you know, they talked about systemic racism? You know, ask the Spirit to breathe on that feeling and to help you understand, because I think like we're so quick to just respond in the moment, but we really need the Spirit to guide us in this. We need the Spirit to help us make sense of something that is very complex, that can only be fixed through the presence of God and the wisdom and the love of God.
Yeah, absolutely. Niels, from your
thanks, Andy. Yeah, I love what Sherry said, even like what Jesus, like, and how he like broke those barriers. And I want to give the example of the parable of the Good Samaritan, because reading this and seeing some articles from it, this is the first time I've ever really seen it from the perspective I'm going to share, right? But in verse 25, an expert in religious law, or a lawyer, says, "What shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Right? Now, I'm not a lawyer, but generally speaking, when a lawyer asks a question, they usually know the answer to it, from what I've seen in Law and Order, right? And so they already know the answer to their question. But Jesus then says, like, well, what does the law of Moses say? And then he's just like, yeah, it says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then he goes on to say to Jesus, well, then who is my neighbor? Jesus then responds with the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan, where he tells the story of a man who was traveling on the Jericho road, gets beaten, stripped, and left for dead by robbers. A priest and a Levite pass by, but none stop to essentially help him out or render aid. Then a Samaritan passes by, sees the man, cares for him, puts him up in an inn, and assures his needs are fully taken care of. So according to Jesus, the Samaritan best modeled how we are to love thy neighbor, right? A common story in which many would agree that is the case. But some would then see it back then. If you're in that moment, they would have been like, whoa, this is like a scandalous story, or maybe something bold to be told to a Jewish crowd. Because the Jews and the Samaritans, like, they had beef. They hated each other. Like they didn't get along, right? So when the lawyer asked the question, like, who is my neighbor? He was probably thinking, just within the realm of his mindset, exclusively like, well, how do I care for the Jews, right? But then Jesus goes on to say, who's my neighbor? And then he responds, now this is what got me, is the expert in religious law says, the one who had mercy on him. And I just bet in that moment that his heart was so convicted and stirred that he couldn't even bring himself to say, It was the Samaritan that was a good neighbor. And acknowledge him by his race, but instead he chose to say the one who had mercy. And so it kind of blew my perspective on this story, right? Because we can see this story of like, yeah, helping someone who's in trouble, or we can see it from the perspective of like, well, maybe I'm the one that's in need, or I'm the one that needs compassion. But what about from the perspective of the lawyer, right? And so this is a story that transcends all racial boundaries and national boundaries, social and economic boundaries. And so I believe that this story and parable is designed to shape our worldview on that. I go on further to think of Micah chapter 6, verse 8, right? Where that verse is talking about seeking justice, love mercy, walk humbly with our God, right? So when we see people who are oppressed, poor, helpless, that's one of the things I love about our church and the Vineyard. Like, we're all about like helping out the poor. And so I love that within our community, right? God tells us that we are to speak for them and defend them according to the word, to stand up for what is right in this case. And even just this past Sunday, as I shared when I was doing communion, like God laid it on my heart to share that we must hunger for justice like we do the Eucharist. Matthew 5:24, it says to go first and be reconciled with our brothers and sisters. Jesus didn't specify color, right? But he directed that we reconcile. And now imagine like the whole world is figuring this out, this reconciliation. Depending on when you're watching this video, we're in the middle of a pandemic right now, the coronavirus, right? And now racial tensions have come up in May and June, right? And so it's like everything is just coming to the surface. And that as we also take these steps of reconciliation, that it is going to cause us to walk humbly, to look deep within ourselves on if like I even have like or to look deep within ourselves and search our heart and say, hey, do I have racial prejudice against others? Or if we need to stand up for our brothers and sisters, whether they are Black or Indigenous, and carry this burden for them. Because something that was interesting that a pastor friend of mine said, who's Black, who's 42, who's my junior high pastor, he had said, like, we just want more people to carry this burden with us. Because he's like, I've been carrying it for 42 years. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, wow, like that is mind-blowing to think of, right? And so this is like a picture uniquely of the church in which we are coming together and carrying our burdens with our brothers and sisters.
Mm.
Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah. Sure, you have something to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I went to the scripture as well this week and thinking about what is our mandate as a church, like how do we actually show love, the love of Jesus in action? And it took me to Romans 12, verses 9 to 15. And this is what it says that we need to do. It says, love must be sincere. We're to hate what's evil and to cling to what is good. In this season of racial tension, we're to be devoted to one another in love. We're to honor one another above ourselves. We're not to be lacking zeal, and we're to keep our spiritual fervor serving the Lord. We're to be joyful in hope for a better future, patient in the affliction, and faithful in prayer. And we're to share with the Lord's people who are in need. And right now we know that our Black brothers and sisters are in need. Mm-hmm. We're to practice hospitality. We're to bless those who persecute us, to bless, and we're not to curse. And we are called to rejoice with those who are rejoicing, and we're called to mourn with those who are mourning. So in this season, when we see such an outcry from the Black community, I feel like the Spirit of Jesus is reminding us about what love in action is, that we are to do those things and to sit with people and to mourn with those who are mourning.
Yeah, that's a great encouragement. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Hey, I've just had, and I guess we're kind of getting probably close to the end of our time together. Although this has been very rich, and I hope it's helpful for people that watch. It's been helpful for me. Thank you. But just shifting gears slightly, like I know that certainly in the Indigenous experience here in Canada for the past 450 years or so, it's just like this litany of all kinds of, you know, racist acts and actually, I mean, racist actions, but also racist acts, like enacted in Parliament, you know, that codified and put into law the subjugation of Indigenous people. And, you know, and residential schools all the way up until I think it was 95 was the last one that was closed, in the 90s anyways. I can't exactly remember in this moment. So it's not exactly ancient history, but some of it is. And I've heard it said that, you know, someone would say, why do I need to repent and apologize for something, you know, that happened a long time ago, you know? And I'm just curious what you guys would say to that. And I guess I'm kind of getting more into it's not even so much about interpersonal acts of injustice via racism, but I guess there are systems and there are structures that are motivated and animated and by you know, well, let's just say demonic, racist attitudes and ideas and that kind of thing, right? And me as a white person, I benefit from that. So that's what white supremacy is as a thing, and you can Google that and look at that. It's not necessarily the Ku Klux Klan, right? Like it's. Yeah. But I'm just curious, just to give a little bit of space for that dialogue, which I know could be a whole other, you know, time together. But do you have any thoughts or comments about that idea?
I think sometimes, like, there's lots of terms that people, you know, use that unless you're kind of interested in that or it impacts you, that you don't really go, you know, to the internet or go buy a book or learn about these things. But it might be helpful to kind of talk about structural racism, or another word for it is like institutional racism that happens. And so basically, like, a way to understand that is like the systems or the structures or the sort of policies or procedures that are in place that disadvantage particular people groups. So, and often you can see where those systematic structural racisms are by the fruit of them. And so you'll see like sort of indicators where people of color, let's say, are not doing as great as people who are white. So for example, you see an indicator would be wealth. An indicator could be involvement in the criminal justice system, access to employment or access to housing, access to healthcare, politics,
family services,
education, yeah, you know, those kinds of things. And I can give you some examples. So, you know, structural racism in Canada, one of the things that there is huge structural racism and policies and things in place are having to do with access to health. So we would say, and Canada boasts, you know, about its healthcare system, but it's not the same access for all Canadians. You know, if you live in a remote community in the north, you don't have access to a doctor like we do here in Winnipeg or in smaller rural communities. You know, you might have access to a nurse practitioner, and you would have to be flown out of your community to access health or to access, you know, appropriate drugs for, you know, the things that you need, or treatment. You know, education, there's bias in education. You know, when I went to school, I didn't learn about the residential school system. I had to learn that when I went to university, you know, as an adult. And why was that? Why wasn't I taught that? Why, you know, why didn't I know that there was, you know, a residential school in Portage la Prairie? You know, why don't we know in Winnipeg that there, you know, are residential schools? You know, why weren't we taught that history? Well, it's because of systemic racism, because history, a story, you know, his story, the story being told is a story that slants the history. It projects one particular people group in better light than the other, you know. And so structural racism can be the omission of information. It can be, you know, hiring practices or advancement practices within companies that are very subtle. You know, I worked in education for a number of years, and I often say this to my husband Paul. I say, you know, who is English. I say to him, I'm like, when you go into meetings, do you take a look around the room and see how many people are like you? And he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, when I go into a meeting, I look around to see if there's any other people of color within that community. Why do I do that? Well, the reason why I do that is because there's structural racism that has prohibited hiring practices and advancement practices, subtle racism within communities that prohibit people from being advanced. You know, whether it because, you know, it's stereotype or whatever, you know, or that people have not had the same kind of access to education than, you know, other people within the community. So there's lots of structural racism, and people don't realize that they don't realize it, and they don't realize that they have benefited from those structures that have been designed actually to promote them and to not promote another people group. And it's really hard for people who actually have that privilege to recognize when they're born with that privilege that they have access to all those powers and resources. It's only people who don't have access to those things that kind of say like, hey, did you notice this? And it's often very difficult to talk to people about that privilege because it feels accusatory, and when you don't even know that it's there, it's very hard to receive that. So yeah, that's, you know, just a beginning of the conversation, but it's kind of helpful just to kind of think about those things in the context of systems in Canada and in the United States.
Yeah, for sure. Niels, what would you add to that?
I think when it comes to, like, you know, apologizing for things that have been done in the past, you know, I wonder, like, if I'm being honest, someone at my age of 32, how is me apologizing going to help? And I'm not saying that I shouldn't, but I think about that, and I think even further and say, okay, what is the call to action? And I think for me, the call to action is carrying this burden, like with my friends, being there for those who are really struggling with this, supporting them in this most vulnerable time, where everything has now come to the surface. Education, learning about the systems that are put in place, as Sherry highlighted. A week after the George Floyd video, my wife and I, Gail, she's white, she's Dutch, half Mennonite background. Like, this has obviously been, you know, a lot for her to process, as this is something that she's been learning about too, and learning and understanding why our friends, as we have mutual friends, are hurting by this. And we watched this documentary on Netflix. It's called 13th, and it's like 13th. Like, search it if you get a chance to watch it. And it essentially talks about the systems that have been put in place against Black people in the United States, right from slavery up until, like, the prison people will find themselves in prison because we think about, like, the war on drugs and all those things which kind of led to those unfortunate systems being in place right now. Well, we were watching the documentary. 20 minutes in, we paused it, and I was just like, hey, like, what's wrong? And she's like, this is making me sick. Like, I don't know that I can watch it. And I was starting to feel sick. And she said, like, I feel like throwing up right now. And I said, exactly. It's because it's so disgusting that these systems are put in place. And so we paused, took a break, and then we're able to get through the rest of the documentary. Despite what I just said, I still encourage people to watch it. So for me, it's the education of everything that's going on in understanding, like, this is why my friends are hurting, and this is how I support them through this, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Andy, I think I would like to add too, it's like when you see, like as a human being, let's just wipe out Christians, like just as a human being.
Wait a minute, what?
I mean, like on a human level.
Yeah.
When we see suffering, our response should be compassion. As a Christian, because we are transformed because of the love of God, it should be our default, is to respond in love. And so when we see, it's like if you saw a child, I'm an adult, there's a child, there's a difference in privilege and power. If I saw a child crying, I don't just sit back and look at that child and say, you should stop crying and you need to soothe yourself and you need to get yourself together because there's no need for you to cry. Let's just reason this out. We don't do that. What we do is we take that child and we comfort that child. And when I think about people suffering and people saying like, well, why do I have to apologize? Why do I have to get involved? Why do I have to show compassion? It's that very thing. You do that because as Christians, as human beings, we are programmed to respond to sorrow and suffering. And if we don't respond to sorrow and suffering, we have to ask the question, why are we not? And so I feel like, when people say that question, like, why should I not? Yeah, ask that question. Take that back to the Lord to say, why do I not feel like I need to be a part of this conversation? Why do I feel that it's not something for me? And I'll guarantee you that the Lord will be very gentle with us, and he is gentle with us, and he will show us how he loves those people. He will show us the love that he has. And when we have a revelation of the love of God, that is transferable in our lives, and we are transformed, and we cannot help but be moved to action from that transformative love.
Very cool. Just as a way of wrap up, and I'm recognizing that I think we're a little over time, but that's okay. What's giving you hope these days? I mean, Sherry, you started off, describing the George Floyd video and the responses, and then finding some hope in there. But I'm just curious.
Mm-hmm. You know what? For me, my hope is in young people. I just love their willingness to learn, their optimism, their hope for the future, their longing to be led and to be righteous. There's something in our young generation that longs for justice, and that's a beautiful reflection of the heart of God, and that gives me hope.
Yeah, awesome.
For me, it's the hope that we serve a God who can transform and change us from the inside out. Like, I'll be honest, and like while I'm here advocating for all these good things, that this season has actually caused me to respond to my own racial biases, right? Like, I think of how comedy shows or comedians, like someone like from like 10 years ago, like Russell Peters would make racially based jokes, and there's one joke that he does in which he talks about how some cultures are more strict in disciplining their kids and others like not so much, right? But then it's like God has really convicted me of that and said, hey, like maybe you shouldn't be listening to that, or maybe even though those are like racially based jokes, that if you say them in the wrong crowd, like they could come across as being ignorant or offensive. And so God has like actually just within the past like 2 to 3 weeks brought that to light within me. And so I've had to confess and ask God to work through that inside of me so that I don't find myself in those positions where I'm making jokes that could be offensive towards others, right? And so I think what gives me hope is knowing that we serve a God who can change us from the inside out, that if I have a racial bias or if someone else does, or if you're watching this and you do, that invite the Holy Spirit to come in and change that inside of you. Talk to someone else, have the difficult conversations. We can work through this together for sure, and it'll empower the church to glorify God on such a great level, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you to both of you.
Thanks
you,
for
Andy.
organizing. This is great. It's been fun.
And thanks to you who are watching. Thank you for joining us. And reconciliation.
Yes.
That's so good. Hashtag
reconciliation. Okay. Cheers.